there's been quite a lot of excitement. It's been described as a ray tracing beast. The actual Sony disclosures to developers are talking about a 2 to 3 times increase in ray tracing performance, sometimes even 4 times increase. There's also been conjecture that we're looking at maybe a preview of RDNA 4 RT architecture here, which again would be quite exciting. Now, this does need to be couched with a certain degree of caution based on the way that Sony is describing the extra RT power. They're talking about games potentially having ray tracing where they don't on the standard PlayStation 5. And they're also talking about, hey, well, if a game has RT reflections on the base PlayStation 5, you could possibly add RT shadows as well. Now, that's obviously great, right? But that seems to be sort of tempering the expectation level somewhat. This 2 to 4 times RT performance, I'd be really interested in your take on this, Alex. I'm just wondering how much of that actually comes from the fact that you have 60 compute units versus 36.
That would be, in terms of RDNA terms, it would be a good way to double the amount of performance in general, because you would essentially have 2 times the amount of ray triangle or array bounding box intersections by virtues of more CUs. Then you would also have, because RDNA 2 and RDNA 3, other than that, do everything in software regarding ray tracing. So all the traversal, all the denoising, anything is done in software there. And if you had double the CUs for the compute there, you would be getting double the performance regarding those tasks, presuming there's not some other confounding factor making them less or more performant. So I think the 2x thing is very reasonable at the exact same settings. It was when you get into 3 or 4 that I wonder what is going on exactly and what that is exactly describing. Because, for example, if you had, we don't know what this is doing hardware-wise, and I think Oliver would like to talk about that too, because he's looked at Mac stuff before, where they have ray tracing, acceleration, and we just don't know at this moment in time, based upon this leak of specs, what exactly this version of RDNA is doing to accelerate ray tracing. If it is taking the RDNA 3 and what it kind of looks like RDNA 4 approach is doing, is where it's kind of adding more instructions, but not adding like specific hardware, which takes over certain aspects of the ray tracing pipeline. There's like a philosophy difference there between AMD and what Intel and NVIDIA do, where it's not like the more core eras of AMD, but like if you add more cores, you get more performance. And NVIDIA and Intel, on the other hand, say, well, there's certain aspects where if you make dedicated hardware for them, you can, save a lot of power and perhaps die space and frame time by just adding a little bit more stuff on the die there and then taking over a task and hyper accelerating it. So NVIDIA, for example, has like a traversal unit. So does Intel, to take care of the traversal aspect of sending array through a BV8 structure. Whether or not that's here in the PlayStation 5 Pro, I cannot tell you. But that potential 3 or 4 number could be referencing the fact that whatever version of the architecture they're using here for RDNA does speed up inordinately in comparison to the other steps of RT. It speeds it up a bit. So maybe there is more ray tracing bounding box intersections that can be done per second per CU than previous architectures or something like that. And that would speed up one aspect of the ray tracing pipeline more, but the overall frame time of a game wouldn't be 3 times or 4 times more, but one aspect of the frame might be 3 times faster than the previous thing.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction here. Marvel's Spider-Man has excellent ray tracing for a console game, right? But, it's not going to be running at, performance mode isn't going to be hitting like 120 frames per second just because the Pro can do twice the RT calculation speed. That's just not the way it works, really.
Right.
It's just one part of the the frame that's being calculated there. Oliver, thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. And when you look at AMD, they are kind of the odd man out here because, as far as I'm aware, Intel, Nvidia, and Apple have all gone with this very like hardware-centric, dedicated hardware-centric approach to tackling ray tracing. And if I look through the document here, the language I think is suggesting, although this is just spitballing, that it's probably using AMD IP because they're not talking about using a custom solution. So I'd have to, again, just kind of like spitballing or thinking this through. I think the more likely thing is that they probably are accelerating individual parts of the ray tracing pipeline. They're probably still using the shaders in a similar manner as the prior RDNA architectures. If this is doing something new, then that would be probably the case, I would think. And yeah, but I guess the other aspect of it would be this document is trying to be pretty informative to developers. So when you look at certain figures like the 45% uplift in general rendering capability in the same workload, that is not a flattering figure. And some of these figures are not super flattering. So maybe this is a case where, hey, Sony is trying to actually tell the developers something practical about the performance of the machine. In which case you'd say, hey, maybe that is actually a more instructive figure in terms of the general capability of the machine and not just speeding up traversal or something.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that we're looking at a more advanced form of RDNA architecture here for sure. I mean, the developer documentation also references that variable rate shading has been added, which, basically would have been there since RDNA 2. Sony decided not to implement it in PlayStation 5, but it just gets added naturally in PlayStation 5 Pro, so that's something that we can confirm there. But yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting to see that generally in terms of the overall design target for PlayStation 5 Pro, Sony itself isn't really promising anything more than much higher effective resolutions, and we'll talk about that at the moment, plus enhanced ray tracing. So it's interesting how they're going to approach this from a marketing perspective, because obviously when PlayStation 4 Pro came along, they had like a dual-pronged approach here. It was like the arrival of 4K screens, and we wanted to produce a console that addressed those screens, and they also added in full HDR support at the same time. Whereas this, it's basically talking almost like it's a machine for Digital Foundry fans almost, higher performance, better resolution almost. Yeah, really interesting stuff, but I'm just wondering how they're going to sell this.
Well, that is interesting, because like when you look at the PS4 Pro, that was really a machine that was marketed at 4K displays, and it did a pretty effective job of that. Whereas here, like you're talking about increased resolution, improved frame rate, which is like, okay, questionable based on what we've discussed so far. And then adding ray tracing and adding graphical features. So I think that the problem here is that they have a machine that sort of is like a bit of a PC style box, where they're saying, hey, developers, pick your poison in terms of these upgrades that you could potentially do with this increased hardware power, which was, of course, was the case with PS4 Pro, but they had a very explicit target in mind with that machine, and the developers had a very specific imperative to go forward with that machine. Whereas here, theoretically, you could see all kinds of different approaches, and I don't know how you market that to people quite.
Right, yeah, definitely. I guess we're going to find out soon enough.